What if the most important records in American history didn't disappear by accident? It sounds like the kind of question that belongs in a conspiracy theory. The kind of question most serious researchers would set aside without much consideration. And honestly, that reaction is understandable. History is full of accidents. Buildings burned all the time. Paper is fragile. Storage conditions in older centuries were genuinely terrible. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for why records go missing. But here's the thing about reasonable explanations. They work best when the pattern beneath the events is also random, when the losses are spread evenly, when the outcomes don't consistently favor one side over another. And in this case, the pattern is not random, not even close. When you begin examining these fires not as isolated incidents, but as a sequence, something starts to feel unusual. Not immediately. At first, each event looks exactly like what it's described as: an accident, a tragedy, a failure of infrastructure, a wooden building with no fire suppression, a basement too close to a furnace, a storage room with no alarm system. These are real explanations. They are documented, and they are individually completely believable. The problem only appears when you step back far enough to see all of them at once. That's when the pattern becomes visible, and that's when the reasonable explanations start to feel slightly less complete. Think about what these fires actually destroyed. Not in general terms, specifically. What categories of records disappeared, and whose records they were. At Ellis Island in 1897, more than 1.5 million individual immigration arrival records burned overnight. These were legal documents. They confirmed that specific people had entered the country through official channels, submitted to inspections, and been granted the right to remain. Those documents were the difference between documented legal status and no proof at all. The people who held them were immigrants, people who had crossed an ocean, arrived with almost nothing, and built whatever they had in a new country. When those records burned, they lost the one piece of paper that officially confirmed their right to be there. In Washington, in 1921, the original population schedules of the 1890 census caught fire in the basement of the Commerce Department building. The 1890 census was significant for reasons that go beyond routine data collection. It was the most detailed population snapshot the federal government had ever attempted. It recorded not just names and addresses, but family structures, property ownership, occupational details, and economic conditions across the entire country. For families trying to trace land claims, inheritance rights, or legal residency decades later, that census was often the only surviving evidence of what their ancestors had owned and where they had lived. When it burned, an entire decade of American life became largely unverifiable. Then there are the courthouse fires. Not one or two, hundreds of them, spread across the American South over more than a century. An Associated Press investigation published in 2001 found that approximately one-third of all county courthouses in southern and border states had burned at least once since the Civil War. In Georgia and Alabama, the figure exceeded 40%. These buildings held property deeds, land titles, ownership records, the physical paper evidence of who had legally acquired what and when. When courthouse records burned, the legal history of land ownership in that county effectively reset. And the people who most needed those records, black landowners trying to prove generational ownership in a legal system that was already working against them, were left with nothing to produce in court. And then there's the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, which burned in July of 1973. That fire destroyed between 16 and 18 million military personnel files, records documenting service in World War I, World War II, Korea, and early Vietnam. These were not administrative documents in some abstract bureaucratic sense. They were the primary evidence that veterans needed to access disability benefits, healthcare coverage, home loan eligibility, and burial honors. Without those files, a veteran's entire service history could simply not be confirmed. Decades of sacrifice reduced to a form letter explaining that the file no longer existed. In every one of these cases, the records that disappeared belonged to people who depended on them most, not people with attorneys who kept copies in multiple locations, not people with the resources to reconstruct a paper trail through alternative channels. The records that burned were held by immigrants, by black landowners, by working-class veterans, by families for whom a single government document represented their only formal connection to legal rights they had earned. That is not a random distribution of loss. It is a consistent one. And consistent patterns, even in the absence of a clear explanation, raise questions that deserve to be examined carefully. Now, it is important to be honest about what that pattern does and does not tell us. The fact that losses fell disproportionately on vulnerable populations does not automatically mean the fires were deliberately set. It is entirely possible, and in many cases, historically documented, that poor and marginalized communities received worse infrastructure, worse storage conditions, and worse institutional attention, simply because they had less political power to demand better. Their records ended up in the most dangerous buildings, not because someone targeted them specifically, but because nobody considered them worth protecting properly. That is a serious problem on its own. It does not require malicious intent to be deeply consequential. But this is where it becomes unclear, because even if the fires themselves were accidental, there are details surrounding them that do not fit neatly into the negligence explanation. At Ellis Island, federal officials had made a specific decision before the fire. They had transported state immigration records from Albany to the island, centralizing them in a single location. Those state records had been safely stored for decades. Moving them to Ellis Island put them in a building that officials already knew was a fire hazard. The replacement station, built after the fire, was constructed from fireproof brick, which means officials understood the danger of wooden construction. They chose it anyway, for a building holding the only copies of 42 years of immigration records. The 1890 census contains a similar detail that is difficult to explain away. Every census before 1890 had been stored with a backup requirement, duplicate copies filed in county offices across the country. The 1890 census was the first for which that requirement was dropped. The original records were stored in a basement next to a furnace room, outside the fireproof vault where other decades of census data sat safely. The decision to remove the backup requirement and the decision to store those specific records in the most dangerous location in the building happened to coincide with the one census that completely disappeared. That could be coincidence, but it doesn't fully make sense as coincidence. At the National Personnel Records Center, officials had explicitly argued against installing a sprinkler system. Their stated reasoning was concern about theoretical water damage from leaking pipes. The building had no fire alarm in its storage areas. No microfilm had been produced of the files. No inventory of the building's contents had ever been created, which meant that when the fire ended, no one could even calculate the full extent of what had been lost. Officials had, in effect, made a series of deliberate decisions that left millions of irreplaceable records with no protection and no backup. Whether those decisions reflected negligence, budget constraints, or something else is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the outcome was the complete and permanent destruction of records that veterans had spent years trying to access. Most historians treat these events as separate tragedies. That framing is reasonable, and it is probably correct for most of the individual fires. An era of poor construction, inadequate fire codes, and underfunded government infrastructure produced exactly the kinds of losses you would expect. Negligence is real. Institutional indifference is real. And in many cases, it is genuinely sufficient to explain what happened. But the problem with treating each fire as a separate tragedy is that it prevents anyone from asking the question that the full sequence raises, which is whether the pattern itself means something, regardless of the cause of any individual fire. Here is the detail that shifts the weight of that question. In Jasper County, Mississippi, in September of 1932, 15 men set fire to a courthouse. That fire was not an accident. It was a deliberate act, later documented and partly confirmed. The safe inside that courthouse was found open the next morning, its contents burned. Property records for the black eastern half of the county were destroyed. Records for the white western half, stored in a separate building miles away, survived completely. Within a few years, a corporation had claimed thousands of acres of formerly black-owned land. Courts granted clear title because no competing deed could be produced. The deeds had burned. That is not negligence. That is a documented, intentional act with a documented economic outcome. And it forces a question that the accidental explanation cannot fully absorb. If it happened deliberately once, in one county, in one night, how confident can anyone be about the other fires? That question does not have a clean answer, and this investigation is not going to pretend that it does. The honest position is uncertainty. Most of these fires were probably accidental. Some may not have been. The pattern of loss is real regardless of cause. The economic consequences are real regardless of intent. The people who lost the most were consistently the people with the least power to recover from that loss or to demand accountability afterward. Whether you call that a conspiracy, a structural failure, or simply the predictable result of a country that stored poor people's records in flammable buildings with no backups and no consequences, the practical outcome is the same. Records burned. Claims evaporated. Land changed hands. Benefits went uncollected. Families hit walls in their history that looked like bad luck, but functioned like something more permanent. And in almost every case, the institutional response to the loss was not restoration. It was slow administrative abandonment. Census records rotted in a warehouse for over a decade before being authorized for destruction. Immigration records were never reconstructed. Veterans received form letters. The records were gone, and the systems designed to protect them moved on without looking back. What makes this worth examining now, decades and in some cases over a century after the fires, is that the losses are not only historical, they are ongoing. Veterans' families are still waiting for files that burned in 1973. Descendants of black landowners are still unable to produce deeds that burned in courthouse fires across the South. Families tracing their immigration history still hit the same wall at 1897. The fires ended. The gaps they created did not. And somewhere in St. Louis, in a climate-controlled preservation room, a technician is still holding a charred military file under infrared light, trying to read a name that someone has been waiting more than 50 years to find. That is where this investigation begins, not with a conclusion, but with a pattern, a sequence of losses that all point in the same direction, all leave the same people without proof, and all raise the same question that nobody has been able to fully answer. What if it wasn't all an accident? The official explanation for most of these fires is, on the surface, quite simple. America in the 1800s and early 1900s was a country that burned. Not metaphorically, literally. Fire was one of the most common and most destructive forces in everyday American life during that period. Cities burned, factories burned, homes burned, and government buildings, which were often older, more crowded, and less maintained than private commercial structures, burned with particular regularity. When historians look at the fires that destroyed major record collections during this era, their starting point is always the same. The conditions that produced these losses were not unusual. They were the standard operating environment of the time. To understand why that explanation carries weight, it helps to understand what American construction actually looked like during this period. Pine was the dominant building material across most of the country. It was cheap, widely available, and easy to work with. It was also extremely flammable. A pine building did not need much encouragement to catch fire. A dropped lamp, a spark from a fireplace, a poorly maintained flue. Any of these could turn a pine structure into a total loss within an hour. And most government buildings of the era were not built to any particular fire safety standard, because no universal standard existed yet. Each city, each county, each federal agency made its own decisions about construction materials and storage conditions. The results were predictably inconsistent. Electrical wiring added another layer of risk as the century progressed. Electricity was spreading rapidly through American buildings in the late 1800s, but the understanding of how to install it safely was still developing. Wiring was frequently run through walls without adequate insulation. Connections were made without proper grounding. Circuits were overloaded in buildings that had been designed for gas lighting, not electrical load. Fires caused by faulty wiring were common enough that they were considered a routine hazard rather than a preventable accident. For a building holding irreplaceable paper records, a single electrical fault in the wrong location could mean a permanent and total loss. Then there were the open flames. Oil lamps and gas fixtures were still in widespread use throughout much of this period, even in buildings that had partial electrical systems. These fixtures burned continuously in rooms where paper records were stored on wooden shelves, sometimes inches away from the flame source. The combination, open fire, dry paper, wooden shelving, wooden floors, wooden walls, was not a fire waiting to happen in some abstract sense. It was a fire that happened constantly, in buildings across the country, for decades. The wonder, in some ways, is not that so many record collections burned. It is that any survived at all under these conditions. The Ellis Island Immigration Station is one of the clearest examples of this problem. The station opened in 1892 and was constructed almost entirely from wood. It processed thousands of arriving immigrants every day, handling enormous volumes of paper documentation in a building that was, by any reasonable assessment, a serious fire hazard. Officials reportedly acknowledged this risk from relatively early in the station's operation. The wooden construction was not a secret. The danger was understood, at least in general terms. Yet the building continued to operate as the primary processing and record storage facility for one of the busiest immigration entry points in the world. When the fire came in June of 1897, the building was gone within 2 hours. That outcome was not surprising given the construction. What it does raise, though, is a quieter question about why the acknowledged risk was allowed to continue for as long as it did. The Commerce Department building in Washington presents a similar picture. The building had a boiler room located directly adjacent to the basement file storage area where the 1890 census records were kept. A boiler room is, by definition, a space that generates significant heat and contains equipment that can malfunction and produce open flame or extreme temperatures. Placing paper records in a room directly next to that kind of heat source was not an unusual decision for the time. It was common. Storage space was allocated wherever it was available, and the basement near the boiler happened to have room. But it is still difficult to look at that arrangement without noting how straightforwardly dangerous it was. The records were kept in the most fire-prone location in the building, and there was no redundancy if something went wrong. The National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis offers perhaps the most direct example of how institutional decisions contributed to record loss. The center stored tens of millions of military personnel files, documents that veterans needed to access benefits, health care, and official recognition of their service. By the time the fire occurred in 1973, fire suppression technology was well developed. Sprinkler systems were standard in many storage facilities. The option to protect those records with a sprinkler system existed and was known to officials managing the center. They chose not to install one. The stated reason was concern about water damage, the idea that a leaking pipe might damage the records the system was designed to protect. That reasoning was documented. It was a conscious administrative decision, not an oversight, and it is where the straightforward negligence explanation starts to feel slightly incomplete, without necessarily pointing toward anything more deliberate. At first, it seems normal that government agencies would weigh different kinds of risk against each other when making infrastructure decisions. Budget constraints were real. Water damage from faulty sprinkler systems was a genuine concern in some contexts. These were not invented reasons, but there's a problem with how that reasoning was applied in the case of the record center specifically. The files stored there had no copies. No microfilm had been produced. No backup system of any kind existed. The decision to forego sprinklers was therefore not a choice between two different types of risk to a recoverable collection. It was a decision to leave an irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind archive with no fire protection and no fallback. That combination, no copies and no suppression, is where the explanation based purely on standard negligence becomes harder to accept without reservation. This is a pattern that appears across more than one case on this list. It is not simply that records burned. It is that records burned in situations where the absence of backup systems seems, in retrospect, like a significant and consequential gap. The 1890 census was the first for which the requirement to file duplicate copies in local offices was dropped. Before 1890, every census had backups at the county level. That redundancy meant that even if a central storage facility was damaged, the information was not entirely lost. For the 1890 census, that protection was removed. The records were centralized in a single location with no duplicates elsewhere. Whether that decision was driven by cost, administrative convenience, or something else is not fully documented. But the outcome was that when the basement fire occurred, there was nothing left to recover from. The same logic applies to Ellis Island. Before the fire, federal officials had made a specific decision to transport New York State's immigration records, which had been stored safely in Albany for decades, to the island for centralized storage. Those state records had existed independently for years. Moving them to Ellis Island put them in a wooden building that officials already knew was a fire hazard. After the fire, the replacement station was built from fireproof brick. The lesson about wooden construction was apparently learned, but the lesson about centralization, about the danger of putting all copies of irreplaceable records in a single location, does not appear to have been applied with the same urgency. This raises a question that the standard negligence explanation does not fully resolve. Why were the records centralized before adequate fireproofing was in place? None of this is to say the fires were deliberately set. That claim would require evidence that, in most of these cases, does not exist. What it is to say is that the conditions surrounding these fires were not purely random. Decisions were made about construction materials, about storage locations, about backup requirements, about fire suppression systems, that consistently left the most important records in the most dangerous conditions with the least redundancy. Each individual decision had a reasonable administrative explanation. Taken together, they produced a pattern of loss that is difficult to fully account for through ordinary bad luck alone. Historians who have studied this period generally land in a similar place. The fires were real accidents, produced by real infrastructure failures in a real era of dangerous building practices. Government negligence was widespread, underfunding was chronic, and the institutional culture around record preservation was genuinely poor across most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. These are not excuses manufactured after the fact. They are documented historical conditions, and they are, for most researchers, sufficient to explain most of what happened. The negligence explanation is not weak. It is well supported. It accounts for the majority of the evidence cleanly, and without requiring additional assumptions. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete in a specific and important way. Negligence explains why buildings burned. It does not fully explain why the buildings that burned were consistently the ones holding records for the most vulnerable populations, with no backup copies, and with no serious attempt at reconstruction afterward. Negligence is usually more random than that. It produces losses that are spread across different groups, different regions, different types of records. The losses here were not spread evenly. They accumulated in one direction, and that directionality is what the standard explanation struggles to account for, even when it handles everything else adequately. That detail sounds minor at first, the question of whether negligence was evenly distributed or not, until it is examined more closely, because the direction of the loss is not incidental to the story. It is the story. Records burned. Specific records, belonging to specific populations, with specific legal claims attached to them. The land in Jasper County still produces oil. The veterans who needed their files are mostly gone now, but their families are still waiting. The immigrants who lost their arrival documentation lost something that could not be reconstructed. The negligence explanation accounts for the fire. It does not account for who bore the cost of it, consistently, across more than 7 decades of American record keeping. The accepted story, old buildings, poor planning, government incompetence, held for a long time because it was largely true, and because the alternative, which requires examining the pattern rather than the individual events, is uncomfortable to sit with. It asks questions that cannot be answered cleanly. It points toward conclusions that the available evidence does not fully support, but also does not fully rule out. It requires holding two things at once: that most of these fires were probably accidents, and that the pattern of loss they created was not accidental in its effects. That tension does not resolve easily, and for a long time, it was easier for researchers and institutions to treat each fire as its own isolated event rather than ask what the sequence, taken as a whole, might mean. That is still largely the approach today. Whether it is the right one is a question this investigation has not finished asking. There is a point in any investigation where the standard explanation starts to develop cracks. Not large ones, necessarily, not the kind that immediately collapse the entire official account. Small ones, details that sit slightly wrong, timings that don't line up as cleanly as they should, decisions that made sense in isolation but look different when placed next to each other. That point in this investigation arrives when you stop looking at these fires individually and start asking a simpler question. If these losses were genuinely random accidents produced by poor infrastructure, what would the pattern of loss actually look like? And does the pattern we can observe match that expectation? Random accidents produce random outcomes. That is almost definitional. If a series of fires sweeps through government buildings across several decades because of pine construction, faulty wiring, and inadequate fire codes, you would expect the records destroyed to reflect the full range of people those buildings served. Wealthy families and poor ones, established citizens and recent arrivals, landowners with attorneys and tenant farmers with nothing but a handshake agreement. The losses would be spread unevenly in some ways. Larger buildings hold more records. Urban facilities process more people. But the direction of the loss would not consistently favor one group over another. Accident does not discriminate with that kind of precision. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the losses in this case did not fall randomly. They fell in a direction, and that direction never reversed. To see this clearly, start with Ellis Island. The fire there occurred on the night of June 15, 1897. By the time it was over, more than 1.5 million individual immigration arrival records had been destroyed. These documents covered 42 years of arrivals, from 1855 through 1897. They were the official federal records, confirming that specific individuals had entered the United States through legal channels, undergone required medical inspections, and been processed by immigration authorities. For the people named in those records, the document was not administrative paperwork in any abstract sense. It was the legal foundation of their right to remain in the country. Without it, their status became a matter of assertion rather than proof. And in a legal system that required documentation, assertion was often not enough. The population those records belong to is worth thinking about carefully. The 42 years covered by those files represented the largest sustained wave of immigration in American history up to that point. Irish families who had fled the famine, Jewish refugees escaping persecution in the Russian Empire, Italian laborers, German craftsmen, Polish factory workers, Scandinavian farmers, people who had made an irreversible decision to cross an ocean, submit to a bureaucratic process, and begin building a life in a country that did not always welcome them warmly. These were not people with legal teams and duplicate filing systems. They were people for whom that one arrival record was frequently the only official documentation they possessed confirming their lawful presence in the United States. When it burned, they had nothing to replace it with. What happened after the fire is, in some ways, more telling than the fire itself. The replacement station was constructed from fireproof brick and opened in December of 1900. The decision to rebuild in brick rather than wood was deliberate. Officials understood, after the fact, that the wooden structure had been dangerously inadequate for a facility holding irreplaceable records. They corrected the construction error. They built something that would survive the next fire. But they made no comparable effort to address the records themselves. No reconstruction project was launched. No attempt was made to gather alternative documentation from shipping companies, from foreign port records, from the files of immigrant aid societies. The records were gone, and the institutional response was to move forward without them. Thousands of people who had entered the country legally now existed in a legal gray area that the government had created and then declined to resolve. That asymmetry is difficult to explain through negligence alone. Negligence would produce an equal failure on both fronts, poor building and poor records management. What actually happened was a selective correction. The building was fixed. The records were not. Someone understood what needed to change in the physical infrastructure and acted on that understanding. The decision not to apply the same urgency to the human records, to the documentation of 1.5 million lives, was a separate decision, made afterward, with full knowledge of what had been lost. This raises questions that the accident explanation does not cleanly answer. Why was one failure corrected and the other simply accepted? The 1890 census presents a different set of problems with the same basic shape. The fire that destroyed those records occurred in January of 1921, in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. But the conditions that made the loss total, the conditions that ensured there would be nothing left to recover, were established years before the fire occurred. And those conditions involve a specific decision that stands apart from the general pattern of government negligence. Every census conducted before 1890 had been stored with a backup requirement in place. The federal government mandated that duplicate copies of census population schedules be filed in county offices across the country. This was not a minor administrative detail. It was a deliberate redundancy system built into the census process specifically to protect against exactly the kind of loss that occurred in 1921. If the central federal copies were destroyed, the county-level duplicates would survive. The information would not be gone. The record of who lived where, what they owned, and how they identified themselves would still exist somewhere in the country, distributed across hundreds of local offices. The 1890 census was the first for which that requirement was dropped. The decision was made before the census was conducted, meaning the records were created without backup protection from the beginning. They existed in a single location, in the Commerce Department basement, on wooden shelves outside the fireproof vault where earlier census records sat safely. At first, that storage arrangement sounds like a routine space allocation decision. But there is a problem. The fireproof vault had room. Other census decades were stored inside it, protected. The 1890 records were stored outside it, unprotected. The physical distinction between what was protected and what was not is documented. What is not fully explained is why the most recent census, the one with no county-level backups, ended up in the less secure location. The 1890 census was also, by most accounts, the most detailed population snapshot the federal government had attempted up to that point. It recorded not just names and ages, but property values, employment status, family structures, physical conditions, and economic circumstances in granular detail. For families trying decades later to establish inheritance claims, land ownership histories, or legal residency documentation, that census represented a uniquely rich source of evidence. Its loss was not equivalent to losing a routine administrative document. It was the loss of the most complete official portrait of an entire generation of Americans, a generation that included the children and grandchildren of formerly enslaved people, newly arrived immigrants, and communities that had almost no other formal documentation of their existence. That detail sounds minor at first, the question of which census was the most detailed, until it is examined more closely, because the populations who depended most on that kind of documentation were precisely the populations with the least access to alternative sources. Wealthy families with established land records, multiple legal documents, and attorneys to manage their affairs could reconstruct most of what the census confirmed through other channels. Poor families, black families, immigrant families, for them, the census entry was often the primary or only official record that placed them in a specific location, attached to specific property, at a specific point in time. When that record disappeared, the legal chain connecting them to their own history was broken in a way that could not easily be repaired. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because you can explain the fire through negligence. Boiler room, wooden shelves, no sprinklers, the physical cause is plausible. But the negligence explanation does not account for the removal of the backup requirement specifically for this census. It does not account for the storage decision that placed these specific records outside the vault while other decades sat safely inside. It does not account for the institutional response afterward, which was not reconstruction, but 2 decades of slow decay, followed by authorized destruction. The damaged record sat in a warehouse from 1921 until 1933. When Congress quietly approved their elimination. The National Archives building had its cornerstone laid 1 day before that authorization. The timing of those 2 events, the formal creation of an institution designed to protect American records and the simultaneous approval of the destruction of the most complete population record in the country's history, is a detail that does not fit neatly into any simple explanation. Some researchers point to budget constraints and administrative disorganization as sufficient causes for all of these decisions. The argument is that underfunded agencies made poor choices consistently, that the backup requirement was dropped for cost reasons, that the storage location was determined by available space rather than deliberate calculation, and that the reconstruction effort never happened because no budget was allocated for it. These explanations are plausible. They are consistent with what is known about how federal agencies operated during this period. They do not require any assumption of intent beyond ordinary institutional failure. Others look at the same sequence of decisions and find the consistency of the outcomes harder to attribute to accident. The backup requirement removed for one specific census, the most recent and most detailed census, stored outside the vault while older ones stayed protected. No reconstruction after the loss. Authorized destruction while the archive building was being inaugurated. Each decision, taken individually, has an administrative explanation. Taken together, they produced a single outcome, the complete and permanent elimination of the most detailed official record of a generation that included America's most vulnerable populations. Whether that outcome was intended or not, it served certain interests and harmed others in ways that were entirely predictable. The Ellis Island case and the census case share a structural feature that is worth naming plainly. In both situations, the records that were lost belonged to populations that were legally and socially vulnerable. In both situations, the loss was made total by the absence of backup systems that had previously existed or could have been created. In both situations, the institutional response after the fire was to address the physical infrastructure and leave the records unaddressed. And in both situations, the people who lost the most were the ones with the fewest alternative ways to establish their legal standing. That is not the pattern random accident produces. Random accident does not select this consistently. However, the evidence available does not support a claim that these specific fires were deliberately set to destroy these specific records. That claim would require documentation that does not exist for most of these cases. What the evidence does support is a narrower and perhaps more unsettling observation, that the conditions surrounding these fires were not purely random, that the decisions made before and after them consistently reduced the chance of recovery, and that the direction of the loss was always the same. Records belonging to people with the least power to replace them burned in buildings with the least protection, with no copies stored anywhere else, and with no serious effort to reconstruct what was gone. That pattern does not resolve cleanly. It sits in an uncomfortable space between accident and intention, between ordinary negligence and something more deliberate. And that discomfort is not something this investigation will try to resolve prematurely. What it will do is keep examining the specific details, the dates, the decisions, the outcomes, and ask whether the pattern holds as the cases multiply. Because if this were two fires, the coincidence argument would be strong. But this is not two fires, and the pattern, as more cases are added to it, does not become easier to explain. It becomes harder. Before going any further into the fires themselves, it is worth pausing on something that the standard historical account tends to move past too quickly. The question of why these records mattered. Not in a general sense. Everyone understands that old documents have historical value, but in a specific, legal, and immediate sense. What did it actually mean, in practical terms, for a person living in the late 1800s or early 1900s to possess one of these documents? And what did it mean, equally specifically, to no longer have it? The answer depends heavily on who that person was. And that distinction between different categories of people and what documents meant to each of them is at the center of everything that follows in this investigation. In the late 1800s, a document was not simply a piece of paper with information written on it. It was, in a very direct sense, legal existence. The American legal system of that era operated almost entirely on documentation. Courts required paper. Land claims required deeds. Immigration status required arrival records. Military benefits required service files. Census entries established that a family existed at a particular address, owned particular assets, and had a legal identity that courts and government agencies could recognize. Without documentation, a claim was not weaker. It was effectively invisible. You could assert that you had arrived legally, owned a piece of land, or served in the military. But assertion without paper was not something most legal institutions of that period were equipped or willing to act on. For families with resources, this system presented manageable risks. A wealthy landowner in the 1890s typically had his property deed recorded in multiple places. His attorney kept a copy. The county courthouse held another. A third might exist in a family safe or a bank vault. Losing one copy was an inconvenience. The claim itself remained intact because the documentation supporting it existed in several independent locations. The same was true for immigration records among families with means. Ship manifests, correspondence with immigration attorneys, documentation from foreign governments. Wealthy immigrant families often had multiple sources that could corroborate their legal arrival. Losing the Ellis Island record was a problem. It was rarely a fatal one. But this is where it becomes unclear when you shift the frame to a different population. For poor families, immigrant families, and newly freed Black Americans, the document situation looked almost nothing like that. A black farmer in Mississippi in the 1890s who had managed to acquire a piece of land, often through extraordinary effort in a system designed to prevent exactly that, typically held one deed, filed in one courthouse, with no attorney keeping a private copy and no family vault storing a duplicate. That single piece of paper in that single courthouse was the entire legal foundation of his land ownership. It was what stood between him and a legal system that was already hostile to his claims and actively looking for procedural grounds to deny them. When that document burned, the land did not automatically transfer to someone else, but the legal pathway to holding onto it had just become dramatically more difficult to navigate. In courts that were not neutral, before judges who were not impartial. The same logic applied with equal force to immigration records. An Italian laborer who had arrived through Ellis Island in 1889 and built 8 years of life in the United States, a job, a rented room, a small network of community, held his legal status in a single arrival record. He had not hired an immigration attorney. He had not kept correspondence with federal agencies. He had arrived, been processed, and gone to work. The document at Ellis Island was his proof. When it burned in 1897, his status did not immediately disappear, but his ability to prove it legally, if that proof was ever demanded, was gone. And in a period when anti-immigration sentiment was rising sharply and legal challenges to immigrant status were becoming more common, that vulnerability was not theoretical. It was a practical exposure to a legal system that could now question something he could no longer definitively answer. Military service files carried the same weight for veterans. A man who had served in the Army between 1912 and 1960 and been discharged had earned, through that service, a set of concrete legal entitlements. Health care through the Veterans Administration, disability compensation if he had been injured, a pension after a certain number of years, burial honors recognizing his service. These were not symbolic benefits. They were financial and medical resources that many veterans, particularly working-class veterans, without other sources of income or health care, depended on substantially. The service file was the legal record connecting the individual to those entitlements. Without it, the entitlement existed in principle, but became enormously difficult to access in practice. The Veterans Administration required documentation. A veteran who could not produce his file faced a bureaucratic process that was, for many, simply impassable. The benefit existed on paper somewhere in policy documents, but the specific paper connecting that veteran to that benefit was gone. And here is the part that history does not always emphasize clearly enough. The people responsible for storing these records were not unaware of the risks. The danger was not hidden from them. It was documented, acknowledged, and in some cases formally noted in official communications. The Ellis Island building was known to be a fire hazard from a relatively early point in its operation. The wooden construction was not a secret. Officials who worked in and around that building understood that a serious fire in that structure could be catastrophic. The acknowledgement was there. The correction was not. Not until after the fire had already occurred and the records were already ash. The Commerce Department basement presented a similar situation. The proximity of the boiler room to the file storage area was not a hidden feature of the building's layout. Anyone who worked in that building knew where the furnace was and knew where the paper records sat in relation to it. The risk of storing irreplaceable documents next to a heat source in a building with no adequate fire suppression was not obscure engineering knowledge. It was obvious to anyone who looked at the arrangement. Yet the records remained where they were, for years, until the fire made the danger undeniable. The National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis is the most direct example of known risk and deliberate decision. By 1973, fire suppression technology was mature. Sprinkler systems were standard in many storage and archival facilities. The option to protect the military files with a sprinkler system was available, known, and explicitly considered by officials managing the center. They decided against it. The reason given, concern about water damage from potential pipe leaks, was documented in administrative records. It was a conscious choice, made with awareness of what the building contained and what the consequences of a fire would be. The decision was not made in ignorance. It was made with knowledge of the risk and a judgment that the risk was acceptable. That judgment turned out to be catastrophically wrong, but it was not uninformed. That detail sounds minor at first, the difference between unknown risk and acknowledged risk, until it is examined more closely, because the moral and legal weight of a loss changes substantially, depending on whether the danger was known in advance. An accident in a building whose hazards were genuinely unrecognized is a tragedy. An accident in a building whose hazards were documented, discussed, and ultimately left unaddressed is something that requires a different kind of accounting. Not necessarily a criminal one, but a more serious examination of why the known risk was allowed to persist, whose records were exposed by that persistence, and who bore the consequences when the inevitable occurred. The answer to that last question is consistent across every case on this list. The people who bore the consequences were the people with the least power to demand better protection. This is not a subtle or ambiguous observation. It is a direct and documentable fact. The populations whose records burned, immigrants, black landowners, working-class veterans, poor families, were not the populations with the political influence to demand fireproof vaults, mandatory backup systems, and adequate suppression equipment. They were the populations that received whatever storage conditions were left over after the priorities of more powerful constituencies had been addressed. Pine shelves in basement file rooms, wooden buildings on islands, warehouses with no alarms and no sprinklers. These were not random allocations. They reflect a hierarchy of institutional attention that placed some records, and by extension some people, at the bottom of the priority list. Some researchers argue that this hierarchy was simply the natural result of political inequality in that era. Marginalized communities had less power, so their records received less protection. The outcome was bad, but it was not deliberately engineered. It was the automatic product of a system that reflected existing social arrangements. That argument has real force. Political power and institutional attention have always been unequally distributed. The idea that record storage conditions would mirror that inequality is entirely plausible and does not require any assumption of intent beyond ordinary bias. Others look at the same facts and find the pattern too consistent to attribute entirely to passive inequality. The argument here is not that each individual storage decision was a targeted act against a specific population. It is that the cumulative effect of those decisions, consistently placing the most legally vulnerable records in the least protected locations, consistently failing to create backup systems, consistently declining to reconstruct what was lost, produced outcomes that were too directional and too consequential to be explained solely through the mechanics of routine neglect. At some point, the argument goes, the consistency of the pattern becomes evidence of something beyond coincidence, even if the mechanism was structural rather than conspiratorial. However, the timeline does not fully match either explanation perfectly. If the losses were purely the result of passive inequality, you would expect some variation. Some cases where well-protected records for marginalized populations survived, some cases where poorly protected records for powerful groups burned. The record does not show much of that variation, and if the losses were the result of deliberate targeting, you would expect more obvious coordination, more direct evidence of intent, more cases like Jasper County where the deliberate nature of the act was documented. Most cases do not have that documentation. The truth, as is often the case in historical investigation, appears to sit somewhere between the clearest available explanations, in a space where passive structural failure and occasional deliberate action overlapped in ways that are now difficult to separate. What can be said with confidence is this: the records that burned mattered enormously to the people who held them. The risk to those records was known, in most cases, before the fires occurred. The populations exposed by those risks were among the most legally vulnerable in American society, and the institutional response, in nearly every case, was to repair the physical infrastructure while leaving the human records unaddressed. The buildings were fixed. The lives they documented were not reconstructed. That asymmetry, consistent across multiple fires, multiple decades, multiple populations, is the detail that the negligence explanation accounts for least well. And it is the detail that this investigation keeps returning to, because it does not go away no matter how many times the accidental explanation is applied to it. In 2001, the Associated Press released the findings of a multi-year investigative project. The team had spent years examining courthouse records, interviewing people across multiple states, and reviewing tens of thousands of public documents. The investigation covered 13 southern and border states. Reporters spoke with more than 1,000 individuals, landowners, historians, local officials, legal researchers, and community members. The findings were later formally entered into the Congressional Record on February 6, 2002, which means they were considered significant enough to be preserved as part of the official legislative history of the United States. That is not a minor distinction. Journalism enters the Congressional Record when it is treated as evidence of something that the government itself needs to acknowledge. The question worth sitting with is what, exactly, that evidence showed. The headline finding was a number. Approximately 1/3 of all county courthouses in southern and border states had burned at least once since the Civil War. In Georgia and Alabama, that figure exceeded 40%. Read quickly. Those statistics can sound like a continuation of the infrastructure argument. Old buildings, fire-prone construction, the same conditions that produced losses everywhere. But the courthouse context changes the meaning of those numbers substantially. A courthouse is not a general-purpose government building. It is a specific kind of institution with a specific kind of content. Courthouses hold property deeds, land titles, ownership transfers, mortgage records, tax histories, the complete paper infrastructure of who owns what and has owned it for how long. When a courthouse burns, it is not administrative paperwork that disappears. It is the legal foundation of land ownership in that county. For everyone whose claim depended on those records, the fire does not just damage a building. It erases the paper evidence of their legal standing. To understand why that matters so specifically in the post-Civil War South, it helps to understand what land ownership meant for Black Americans in that period. After emancipation, land was not simply an economic asset. It was the primary mechanism through which a formerly enslaved person could establish legal independence, build generational wealth, and create a foundation that their children could inherit. Acquiring land required overcoming enormous legal and social barriers, discriminatory lending, hostile local officials, outright violence. The families that managed it despite those barriers had done something genuinely extraordinary, and the deed to that land, filed in the county courthouse, was the legal proof of what they had accomplished. It connected them to the property in a way that courts were supposed to recognize and protect. When the courthouse burned and the deed with it, that connection was severed. Not informally, legally. In a courtroom, the AP investigation did not just document the frequency of courthouse fires. It examined what survived and what did not, and it is here that the accidental explanation begins to develop serious problems. In county after county across the region, a pattern appeared in the records. Property documentation for Black landowners had burned. Property documentation for white landowners, frequently stored in separate buildings or separate sections of the same building, had survived. This was not a universal finding in every county examined, but it was consistent enough across enough counties that the reporters identified it as a pattern rather than a coincidence. The direction of the loss was not random. It aligned, repeatedly, with the racial identity of the record holder. At first, there are several ways to interpret that finding without assuming deliberate targeting. Separate storage locations could reflect simple administrative history. Different record sets accumulated in different places over time for mundane bureaucratic reasons. The buildings that survived might have been newer, better constructed, or located in lower-risk areas of the courthouse complex. The distribution of surviving records might reflect the distribution of record-keeping practices rather than any deliberate selection. These alternative explanations deserve serious consideration. Investigative journalism, even journalism entered into the congressional record, is not the same as a legal finding. Patterns in historical data can reflect many different underlying causes. The AP investigation identified something that required explanation. It did not definitively establish what that explanation was. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the AP team did not stop at the fire damage. What they found when they went beyond the burned buildings and into the surviving records is what separates this investigation from a story about infrastructure failure. In courthouse after courthouse, reporters found evidence of record loss that had nothing to do with fire. Deed books with pages physically torn from them, not damaged, not water-stained, not charred at the edges, torn out. File folders that should have contained ownership documentation were empty, with no record of when the contents had been removed or by whom. Tax records showed alterations in crude handwriting that did not match the original entries. Numbers changed, names modified, details overwritten in ways that were visually obvious to anyone examining the documents directly. That detail sounds minor at first. Altered handwriting in old tax records could reflect many things: corrections made by clerks, administrative updates, routine amendments, until it is examined more closely, because the alterations the AP team documented were not the kind of careful, dated, initial corrections that legitimate administrative changes typically produce. They were crude, visually inconsistent with the surrounding text, made in different ink, in different handwriting, without the formal notations that official amendments require. They looked, to the reporters examining them, like someone had simply written over existing information without any pretense of following proper procedure. And in a document that establishes land ownership and tax liability, changing a name or a number, even crudely, can have significant legal consequences if the original entry no longer exists to contradict the alteration. The most immediately striking finding, however, was something the reporters discovered while the investigation was still in progress. Documents that were days away from being destroyed. Records that custodians, the officials legally responsible for maintaining and preserving them, openly admitted were marked for shredding. The AP team physically retrieved dozens of these records before they could be eliminated. This is not a historical finding about something that happened a century ago. These were active destruction processes, ongoing at the time of the investigation, being carried out by the very offices whose legal function was to preserve the documents in question. The investigators arrived, saw what was happening, and removed the records from the destruction queue. Without that intervention, those specific documents would have been gone within days, through a process that the responsible officials apparently considered entirely routine. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because shredding old records is not, by itself, unusual or improper. Government offices regularly purge outdated documents according to established retention schedules. The question is whether the specific records being destroyed were subject to those schedules, whether the schedules themselves were being applied appropriately, and whether the pattern of what was being eliminated reflected anything beyond routine administrative housekeeping. The AP investigation raised serious concerns on all three counts. The records being shredded were not routine administrative documents past their retention dates. They were ownership and title records, the kind of documentation that can have ongoing legal significance for land claims that may not have been resolved for generations. Destroying them was not equivalent to shredding 5-year-old budget memos. The combination of findings the AP team assembled, courthouse fires concentrated in specific regions at rates far exceeding normal accident probability, surviving records showing physical removal and crude alteration, ongoing destruction of legally significant documents by the offices responsible for protecting them, pointed toward something that fire alone could not explain. Fire is visible. It produces ruins and ash and an obvious event that can be investigated, documented, and assigned a cause. What the AP investigation revealed was that fire had been operating alongside something quieter, a slower, less dramatic, less visible process of erasure that did not require a match or a flame. Pages torn from books, folders emptied, records altered, documents shredded, each action individually deniable. Collectively, they described a pattern of interference with the documentary record of land ownership that had been happening, apparently, for decades. Some researchers who reviewed the AP findings argued that the investigation, while important, could not establish intentional targeting without more direct evidence of coordination or deliberate selection. Torn pages might reflect mishandling or deterioration. Empty folders might reflect misfiling rather than removal. Altered records might reflect legitimate but poorly executed corrections. The destruction of records might reflect genuine compliance with retention schedules, even if those schedules were applied carelessly or inappropriately. These counterarguments are not frivolous. Historical evidence of this kind, scattered across hundreds of counties, accumulated over more than a century, is genuinely difficult to interpret with certainty. Patterns that appear directional from a distance can sometimes dissolve into more ambiguous explanations when examined at closer range. Others looked at the same evidence and found the counterarguments insufficient. The argument here is not that every torn page or empty folder was a deliberate act. It is that the volume and consistency of what the AP team found across 13 states, over more than 130 years of courthouse history, is not plausibly explained by random mishandling and administrative carelessness. Random mishandling produces random damage. It does not produce consistent patterns where records for one population are systematically more likely to be missing, altered, or destroyed than records for another. The directionality of the loss, visible in the courthouse data as it was visible in the federal record losses examined earlier, is what the accidental or negligent explanation struggles most to accommodate. What the AP investigation did, perhaps most importantly, was establish that fire was not the whole story. It was the most obvious and most dramatic element. Courthouse fires are visible events. They produce newspaper coverage, insurance claims, and official investigations. They are hard to ignore and easy to document. But the quieter forms of erasure, the torn pages, the empty folders, the crude alterations, the routine shredding, were happening in the same buildings, in the same counties, during the same period, and they left far less visible traces. By the time the AP team arrived to examine records, some of what had been removed or altered was simply gone, with no record of its existence beyond the gaps it left behind. You cannot document what has been completely eliminated. You can only note the shape of the absence. However, the timeline does not fully match a simple story of deliberate, coordinated destruction. If courthouse records were being systematically eliminated to facilitate land transfers, you would expect to find a cleaner pattern, more complete destruction of specific record categories, less evidence of partial alteration and selective removal. What the AP found was messier than that. Some records were gone entirely. Others were damaged but partially legible. Still others had been altered rather than destroyed. The pattern suggested something less organized than a coordinated campaign and something more persistent than random accident. It suggested, perhaps, a range of actors over a long period of time, making individual decisions that happened to accumulate in the same direction, toward the elimination of documentation that supported black land ownership claims. That raises a question this investigation cannot answer definitively: whether the pattern the AP documented reflects coordinated action, independent actors responding to similar incentives, institutional indifference that allowed ongoing destruction to proceed unchecked, or some combination of all three. The evidence supports multiple interpretations. It rules out very few of them. What it does not support is the conclusion that nothing unusual was happening. The numbers alone, 1/3 of Southern courthouses burned, pages torn, records altered, documents actively being shredded by their custodians, describe something that requires a more complete explanation than infrastructure failure and bureaucratic carelessness can provide. Fire was the loudest instrument in this process. The AP investigation made clear it was not the only one, and that finding, entered into the congressional record and never formally refuted, sits in the historical record as a question that has not received an answer proportional to its weight. Among all the cases examined in this investigation, one stands apart, not because it is the largest in scale, or because it produced the most dramatic economic consequences, but because it is the most thoroughly documented. It is the case where the gap between the accidental explanation and the observable evidence is smallest, where the facts on the ground leave the least room for alternative interpretation. It is also the case that forces every other fire on this list to be reconsidered, because if it happened deliberately once, With this level of specificity and this clarity of outcome, then the question of how many other fires followed a similar logic becomes genuinely difficult to set aside. The location is Paulding, Mississippi. The date is September 10th, 1932. That night, 15 men set fire to the Jasper County Courthouse. This is not a matter of historical inference or pattern analysis. The fire was deliberate. The number of participants was later documented. What those 15 men destroyed that night was not a building in any general sense. They destroyed something far more specific. Every property deed and land title covering the black eastern half of Jasper County. Those records represented the legal ownership history of thousands of acres of land. They documented who had purchased what, when, and from whom. They were the paper foundation of black land ownership in that part of the county. When they burned, the legal connection between black families and their land did not immediately dissolve, but it became enormously vulnerable in a legal system that required paper to recognize claims. The geographic detail of what burned and what survived is the first element of this case that does not fit the accidental explanation. Records for the white western half of Jasper County were stored in a separate building, located miles away from the courthouse. That building did not burn. Its contents survived completely. The fire destroyed the records of one population and left the records of another entirely intact. This was not the result of one fire spreading unevenly through a single building. It was the result of a fire set in a specific location that held specific records, while a geographically separate location holding different records was left untouched. That separation, the deliberate targeting of one record set while another sat safely miles away, is not something the negligence explanation can absorb. Negligence does not operate with that kind of geographic precision. To understand the full significance of what happened next, it helps to understand what was happening in Jasper County before the fire. The courthouse did not burn in isolation. It burned at the end of a period of sustained, organized violence against black landowners in the county. The Ku Klux Klan had been active in the area. Black farms had been attacked. Black families had been threatened, assaulted, and in some cases killed. Farmers had been driven off land they legally owned through campaigns of terror that the local legal system did not effectively prosecute or prevent. By the time the fire occurred in September 1932, many black landowners in the county had already been forced to abandon their properties through violence. They were gone. Their land sat empty or occupied by others. What remained connecting them legally to that land, what could still theoretically be used in a court to establish their ownership, were the records in that courthouse. Those records were what burned. The timeline that followed the fire is where the economic dimension of this case becomes fully visible. The fire occurred in September 1932. For several years afterward, the land question in Jasper County existed in a kind of legal limbo. Properties that black families had been driven from were unoccupied or informally held. The deeds that would have proven their ownership were gone. The families themselves, in many cases, had been displaced by violence and were not in a position to pursue legal remedies in courts that were not operating neutrally on their behalf. Then, in December 1937, a corporation filed a legal claim. It sought title to more than 9,500 acres of land in the county. The court was asked to grant clear ownership. The corporation reported that it could locate no one with a competing claim to the property. The court ruled in the corporation's favor in 1938. Clear title was granted. The legal transfer was complete. The reason no competing claim could be located is not complicated. The competing claims had burned 5 years earlier. The deed records that would have connected black families to their land, the documents a court would have required to recognize their ownership, no longer existed. The corporation had not needed to disprove those claims. It had simply needed to wait until the absence of documentation made them legally invisible. 850,000 barrels of oil have since been extracted from that property. The land later passed to international paper. The economic value generated from those acres, in oil, in timber, in mineral rights, has flowed continuously from land whose original ownership documentation burned in a courthouse fire set by 15 men on a September night in 1932. But this is where it becomes unclear in a way that goes beyond the timeline. Because of what was found the morning after the fire, when investigators and officials arrived at the burned courthouse, They found a safe. It was inside the building, in the area where the most sensitive records would have been stored. The safe had survived the fire structurally. Safes are built to withstand heat, and this one had not been destroyed by the flames, but its contents had been reduced to ash. That outcome requires a specific condition. For the contents of a closed safe to burn completely, the safe must be opened during the fire. A properly closed safe protects its contents from exactly the kind of heat a building fire produces. The contents of this safe did not survive. The safe was found open the morning after the fire. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A safe found open after a courthouse fire has two possible explanations. Either someone forced it open, broke the lock, cut the hinges, used tools to access it before or during the fire, or someone opened it with knowledge of the combination and either left it open deliberately or removed the contents before the fire began and ensured they would not survive. The safe was not found forced. There was no evidence of the kind of physical damage that forced entry produces. It was simply open, which means someone with authorized or unauthorized but knowledgeable access to that safe had opened it. And whatever had been inside, the most protected documents in that courthouse, the records considered important enough to be stored in a fireproof container, was ash by morning. This is the detail that separates the Jasper County case most clearly from the infrastructure failure explanation. A boiler room fire that spreads to paper records on wooden shelves is negligence. A fire set by 15 men that destroys one population's land records while leaving another's intact, preceded or accompanied by the deliberate opening of the courthouse safe, is something that requires a different category of explanation. It is not a fire that happened to destroy records. It is a fire that was set specifically to destroy records. And the safe detail suggests that whoever was involved understood which records mattered most and took specific action to ensure those particular documents did not survive even the protection designed to preserve them. The AP investigation, conducted nearly 7 decades after the fire, confirmed additional details that deepen the picture. At least 204.5 acres of the land claimed by the corporation in 1938 had belonged to black owners who had already been driven out by Klan violence before the fire. This means the sequence was not fire, followed by displacement. The displacement came first. Families were terrorized off their land through violence. Then the documentary evidence of their ownership was destroyed. Then the legal system processed the transfer through a court that found no competing claims. Each stage of the process built on the previous one. The violence created the vacancy. The fire eliminated the paper trail. The court formalized the result. The entire sequence, from the first Klan activity in the county to the corporate land claim filed in 1937, functioned as a coordinated, multi-stage process even if each individual element could be treated as a separate event. Some historians who have examined the Jasper County case argue for caution in drawing broad conclusions from a single documented instance. The deliberate nature of this fire is established, but using it as a lens through which to reinterpret every other courthouse fire in the South requires an inferential step that the evidence does not fully support. The argument is that one confirmed case of deliberate arson, however clear, does not automatically make every other fire suspicious. Buildings burned for accidental reasons constantly during this period. The fact that the outcomes were often similar, black land record destroyed, white land records preserved, might reflect the geography of record storage as much as deliberate targeting. Different records in different buildings produce different survival rates without requiring any deliberate selection. Others find that argument insufficient given the scale of the AP findings. One confirmed case of deliberate arson, combined with a pattern of 40% courthouse fire rates in some states, pages torn from deed books, records altered in crude handwriting, and documents actively being shredded by their custodians. That combination, the argument goes, describes something that cannot be fully explained by the geography of storage and the randomness of accident. The Jasper County case does not prove that every other fire was deliberate, but it establishes that deliberate courthouse fires targeting specific record sets did occur, that the mechanism existed, was used, and produced the exact economic outcomes that the pattern across the South consistently delivered. Once that is established, the question is not whether it happened, it is how often. However, the timeline does not fully resolve that question. The Jasper County fire is documented because 15 men were identified, because the geographic separation of what burned and what survived was stark enough to be undeniable, and because the safe detail provided a specific piece of physical evidence that pointed toward deliberate action. Most courthouse fires in the South did not leave behind evidence that clear. They left ruins, insurance claims, and official findings of accidental cause. Without the specific combination of factors present in Jasper County, the deliberate nature of a fire, even one that produced identical outcomes, would be almost impossible to establish from the historical record, which raises a question this investigation cannot answer. How many fires that produced the same pattern, black records destroyed, white records preserved, land transferred through courts that found no competing claims, were deliberate, and simply lacked the specific evidentiary details that made Jasper County documentable? What is documentable is the outcome. 850,000 barrels of oil, thousands of acres transferred through a legal system that required paper to recognize claims that no longer had paper to support them, a safe found open the morning after the fire, 15 men, a pattern that repeated across hundreds of counties over more than a century. The Jasper County case does not explain everything on this list, but it establishes something important. It establishes that the mechanism was real, that people with knowledge of how courthouse records worked, and which records mattered most, and how to ensure specific documents did not survive a fire, did exist and did act. Whether they acted once or 100 times is a question the burned records themselves can no longer answer. There is a difference between looking at individual events and looking at a sequence. When you examine a single fire, you see a building, a cause, a loss. The explanation that presents itself is local. This building had wooden construction. This basement had a furnace. This facility lacked a sprinkler system. The loss is real and the cause is plausible, and the investigation, if one occurs at all, tends to close fairly quickly. But when you step back far enough to see multiple events laid side by side, different buildings, different decades, different cities, different record types, something else becomes visible. Not necessarily a single explanation, but a structure, a repeating shape that appears across cases that are otherwise unconnected. And it is that structure, more than any individual fire, that is the most difficult part of this investigation to account for through coincidence alone. The first element of that structure is what might be called the backup problem. In case after case on this list, the records that were destroyed had no copy stored anywhere else. This is not simply a general observation about poor archival practices in an earlier era. It is a specific and consistent feature of the losses that matter most to this investigation. And in several cases, the absence of backup copies was not the result of oversight or resource limitation. It was the result of a deliberate decision to remove or never create redundancy for a specific set of records. The 1890 census is the clearest example. As discussed earlier in this investigation, every census conducted before 1890 had been stored with a mandatory backup requirement. County-level duplicate copies existed across the country, providing a distributed safety net that ensured no single fire could eliminate the entire record. That requirement had been in place for decades. It was a known and established protection. For the 1890 census, specifically and only for that census, the requirement was dropped. The records were created without backup protection from the beginning. When the Commerce Department basement fire occurred in 1921, there was nothing to fall back on. The loss was total because the redundancy that had protected every previous census simply did not exist for this one. Why that specific census was the first to lose that protection is a question that does not have a fully documented answer. The Ellis Island situation followed a similar logic, though the mechanism was different. State immigration records that had been stored safely in Albany for years were transported to the island before the fire and centralized in a single location. The decision to move those records, to take distributed copies and consolidate them in one building, was made before any fire occurred. It was an administrative choice about how records should be organized, but its practical effect was to eliminate the geographic distribution that had previously protected those records from total loss. When the wooden building burned, there was no Albany copy to recover from. The centralization decision had ensured that, whether that decision was made for administrative convenience, cost efficiency, or some other reason, is not fully documented. What is documented is the outcome it produced. The National Personnel Records Center presents perhaps the most straightforward version of the backup problem. By 1973, the technology to create backup copies of paper records through microfilming was well established and widely used in archival facilities across the country. Microfilm was not an experimental or expensive technology at that point. It was standard practice for collections considered important enough to protect. The military personnel files in St. Louis, tens of millions of records documenting the service of millions of Americans across multiple wars, had never been microfilmed. No backup existed in any format. No catalog of the building's contents had been created. When the fire ended, officials could not even calculate the full extent of what had been lost because no inventory had ever been produced. The decision not to microfilm those records, not to create any form of backup, was not a decision made in ignorance of the technology. It was a decision made in an era when the tools for protection were available and the choice not to use them was deliberate. The backup problem, taken across all these cases, raises a question that individual explanations do not answer cleanly. Why were the records that burned consistently the ones with no copies? Budget constraints explain some cases. Administrative disorganization explains others. But the consistency of the pattern, the way the absence of backup copies appears specifically in the cases where the losses were most consequential for the most vulnerable populations, is something that budget and disorganization alone do not fully account for. Random negligence produces random gaps. This pattern is not random in its distribution. The second element of the structure is the timing problem, and this is where the sequence becomes harder to set aside as coincidence. Records did not simply burn at random points in the calendar. They tended to become most vulnerable at moments when their legal significance was about to peak, when the claims they supported were approaching a point of formal resolution or active contestation. The Jasper County Courthouse burned in September 1932. The corporate land claim for more than 9,500 acres was filed in December 1937. The 5-year gap between those events is not incidental to the story. It is the gap during which the absence of competing documentation became legally operative. The families who had been driven off that land by violence were gone. The records that could have supported their claims in court were ash. The corporation that filed in 1937 did not need to wait for the fire to plan its claim. It simply needed to wait long enough for the legal vulnerability created by the fire to become the established condition of the record. By 1937, that condition was firmly in place. The court found no competing claims. Clear title was granted. The timing between the destruction of the documentation and the filing of the claim that benefited from its absence is precise enough to be uncomfortable. The veteran situation presents a different version of the same timing structure. American veterans began filing disability and benefits claims in significantly larger numbers after World War II. The veterans of that war, along with those of Korea and early Vietnam, were reaching the point in their lives when healthcare access, disability compensation, and pension benefits were becoming critical needs rather than distant entitlements. The claims pipeline was growing. The records needed to support those claims, the military personnel files in St. Louis, were the primary documentation connecting individual veterans to the benefits they had earned. The Record Center fire occurred in 1973. At precisely the period when that claims pipeline was most active and most dependent on those files. Whether the timing was coincidental or not is genuinely unclear, but the effect was the same regardless of cause. The records burned at the moment their legal function was most actively needed. However, the timing problem alone does not establish intent. Legal claims follow from record losses in ways that are sometimes mechanical rather than planned. A corporation that learns a courthouse has burned might opportunistically file a land claim, not because it anticipated the fire, but because it recognizes the legal opening the fire has created. Veterans filing claims in large numbers after the 1973 fire were not responding to something that was timed for them. They were simply aging into the period of life when those claims become necessary. The timing that appears meaningful from a pattern perspective might reflect opportunism, responding to accident rather than coordination preceding it. Both explanations are consistent with the observable sequence. The evidence does not cleanly distinguish between them. The third element of the structure, and in some ways the most quietly significant, is the response problem. In almost no case on this list was there a serious, sustained, well-resourced attempt to reconstruct what was lost after the fire ended. This is not a minor administrative footnote. It is a consistent institutional choice, repeated across different agencies, different decades, and different categories of record loss, that determined whether the damage from these fires would be temporary or permanent. The 1890 census records did not burn immediately and completely in the 1921 fire. They were damaged, significantly damaged, but portions survived in degraded condition. Those surviving fragments were moved to a warehouse, where they sat for more than a decade. During those 12 years, no serious reconstruction effort was launched. No team was assembled to assess what was legible and what could be recovered. The records simply deteriorated further in storage, their condition worsening with each passing year, until December 1932, when the Census Bureau quietly recommended their destruction. Congress authorized the elimination on February 21, 1933. The decision to destroy what remained was made not in the immediate aftermath of the fire, when the loss was fresh and the institutional failure was visible, but more than a decade later, after the records had been allowed to decay to the point where destruction could be framed as a practical necessity rather than a choice. That framing is worth examining. The records did not become unsalvageable because destruction was inevitable. They became unsalvageable because no one had intervened to prevent it during the decade they had to do so. Immigration records from Ellis Island were never seriously reconstructed at all. No federal project was launched to gather alternative documentation from shipping company manifests, from foreign port records, from the files of immigrant aid organizations that had processed arrivals during the same period. Those alternative sources existed. They were incomplete and imperfect, but they represented a potential basis for partial reconstruction that was simply never pursued. The immigrants who had lost their documentation received no systematic assistance in reestablishing their legal status. The institution moved on. The people it had failed did not have the option to do the same. Veterans who needed their files received form letters. The letter explained that the record had been destroyed in the 1973 fire and offered a process for attempting reconstruction from alternative sources, pay records, separation documents, unit records that might partially corroborate service history. That process was real, and some veterans successfully navigated it, but it placed the burden of reconstruction entirely on the individual rather than on the institution that had failed to protect the records. A veteran with resources, persistence, and knowledge of the system could sometimes recover enough documentation to support a claim. A veteran without those advantages often could not. The institutional response sorted outcomes by the same variable, individual capacity to navigate a system that had always sorted them. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the response problem is not simply about resources or administrative capacity. Reconstruction efforts for damaged or destroyed records have been undertaken in other contexts when the institutional will to undertake them existed. The decision not to reconstruct, not to pursue alternative documentation, not to allocate resources to recovery, not to treat the loss as an emergency requiring systematic response, was made repeatedly across different agencies in different decades, and it was made consistently in cases where the people who had lost the most were the least positioned to demand better. That detail sounds minor at first, the question of institutional response after a fire, until it is examined more closely, because the response determines whether a loss is temporary or permanent. A fire that destroys records but is followed by a serious reconstruction effort produces a different outcome than a fire that destroys records and is followed by silence. The fires on this list were followed by silence. Not universally, not without exception, but consistently enough that the pattern of non-response is as legible as the pattern of loss itself. Records burned, claims evaporated, silence followed, and then, in case after case, at intervals of months or years or decades, a transfer occurred. Land changed hands through courts that found no competing documentation. Benefits went uncollected by veterans who could not prove their service. Family histories hit walls that could not be climbed because the records that would have provided footholds no longer existed. The three problems, backup, timing, response, do not individually prove anything beyond what the evidence in each case already establishes. Taken together, however, they describe a structure that appears too consistent to be fully explained by the randomness of accident and the ordinariness of negligence. Random systems do not produce this kind of directional consistency. They produce losses that spread across populations, record types, and institutional responses without the persistent alignment toward the same outcome that this sequence displays. Whether that alignment reflects coordination, structural bias, opportunistic exploitation of accidental losses, or some combination of all three, is a question this investigation has not finished examining. But the structure itself, backup removed, timing precise, response absent, transfer following, is visible in the record. And once it is visible, it cannot easily be unseen. At some point in any investigation like this one, the question of scale has to be addressed directly, not in terms of how many buildings burned or how many record collections were lost. Those numbers have been examined throughout this investigation, but in terms of what those losses actually meant economically. What was the material value of what disappeared when the records burned? And is it possible to calculate that figure with any meaningful precision? The answers to those questions are both important and deeply uncomfortable. Important because the economic dimension of this story is where the abstract pattern of record loss connects to the concrete reality of generational wealth, or the absence of it. Uncomfortable because the calculation, when attempted seriously, runs into a problem that is itself a product of the losses being investigated. Start with a baseline figure that is well documented. In 1910, Black Americans owned between 16 and 19 million acres of farmland across the United States. That represented approximately 925,000 individual farms, roughly 14% of all farms in the country at that time. Those numbers are significant on their own. They represent an extraordinary accumulation of land ownership by a population that had been legally prohibited from owning property less than 5 decades earlier, that had been systematically denied access to credit and legal protections, and that was operating within a social and legal environment that was actively hostile to Black economic advancement in virtually every region of the country. Acquiring that land, in that context, represented generations of effort, sacrifice, and legal navigation under conditions that were designed to prevent exactly the outcome those families had achieved. By 1997, 90% of that acreage was gone. Black farmers held fewer than 3 million acres, a reduction of between 13 and 16 million acres over less than a century. That loss did not happen in a single event or through a single mechanism. It accumulated over decades through a combination of forces: discriminatory federal agricultural lending programs, legal manipulation of inheritance laws, outright fraud, economic pressure, racial violence, and the systematic destruction of the documentation that established legal ownership. Separating the contribution of each factor to the total loss is difficult. Separating the contribution of record destruction specifically is, for reasons that will become clear, essentially impossible. A team of economists affiliated with the American Bar Association attempted to calculate the cumulative value of lost Black agricultural land, compounding forward from the point of loss to 2020. Their conservative estimate was $326 billion. That figure is worth sitting with for a moment before moving past it. It is not a round number chosen for rhetorical effect. It is the product of a serious economic analysis, applying standard compounding methodology to documented land values at the time of loss, adjusted forward through decades of agricultural land appreciation. The methodology is the same kind used in legal proceedings to calculate damages in property cases. The result, $326 billion, represents the conservative end of the range. The upper estimates were higher, but this is where it becomes unclear, because that $326 billion figure is incomplete in ways that are not minor. It counts only the farmland, only the agricultural acreage that can be identified, valued, and traced through surviving records. It does not include the value of businesses that were lost when ownership documentation disappeared. It does not include the commercial property, the urban lots, the small enterprises that Black families had built in towns and cities across the country and that became legally vulnerable when the records supporting their ownership burned or were destroyed. It does not include the oil extracted from Jasper County, 850,000 barrels from land whose deed records burned in 1932 and whose legal ownership was transferred to a corporation in 1938. It does not include the timber harvested, the mineral rights exploited, the water rights claimed on land whose original ownership documentation burned in any of the hundreds of courthouse fires documented across the South over more than a century. The figure of $326 billion counts only the dirt, and even counting only the dirt, it reaches a number that is genuinely difficult to absorb. The actual total, if a total could ever be calculated, would be larger. How much larger is unknowable. And the reason it is unknowable brings this investigation back to the central problem that has been present throughout. The records that would make a complete calculation possible are the very records that burned. To trace exactly how much of the 90% land loss connects directly to a courthouse fire, you would need the property records from those courthouses. To calculate the value of businesses lost when ownership documentation disappeared, you would need the ownership documentation. To determine precisely how many acres in how many counties transferred from black ownership to corporate or white ownership following specific fire events, you would need the pre-fire deed records and post-fire transfer records from those counties. Those records no longer exist in most cases. The fire consumed not just the current documentation, but the evidentiary foundation of any future accounting. That detail sounds minor at first, the idea that the records needed to calculate the loss are the same records that were lost, until it is examined more closely, because it creates a situation that is, from an investigative standpoint, uniquely resistant to resolution. In most cases of large-scale economic harm, the harm can be calculated, incompletely perhaps, with margins of error, but calculated because some documentation survives. Insurance records, court filings, tax assessments, alternative records from other sources. The calculation is difficult, but not impossible. In this case, the specific category of loss that most needs to be quantified, the land that transferred as a direct result of record destruction, is precisely the category for which the documentation was most completely eliminated. The absence of records does not just make the loss harder to prove. It makes the scale of the loss literally unknowable. This creates an evidentiary situation that some researchers find significant in itself. A system of harm that eliminates the records needed to measure it is a system that is, in a practical sense, self-concealing. Whether that concealment was intended or is simply an incidental feature of record destruction as a mechanism of dispossession is one of the central questions this investigation cannot resolve. But the practical effect is the same regardless of intent. The full scale of what was lost cannot be calculated. The $326 billion estimate is real and serious and documented. It is also, almost certainly, an undercount. By how much, no one can say. The evidence needed to say it burned. Some researchers and historians who have examined this question argue that the land loss is adequately explained without reference to deliberate record destruction. The argument is that discriminatory lending, hostile inheritance laws, economic pressure, and outright fraud were sufficient to produce the 90% reduction in black farmland ownership without any systematic destruction of property records. Under this view, the courthouse fires and the record losses were contributing factors in some cases, but not the primary mechanism of dispossession. The primary mechanism was the legal and economic system operating as it was designed to operate, excluding black ownership through formal channels rather than through the destruction of documentation. This argument has real historical support. The discriminatory practices it identifies were real, documented, and consequential. Others look at the same evidence and find that argument incomplete. The counterargument is not that discriminatory lending and legal manipulation did not occur. They clearly did. It is that those mechanisms and the destruction of property records were not alternative explanations for the same phenomenon. They were complementary mechanisms that operated together. Violence drove families off land. Record destruction eliminated the documentation of their ownership. Discriminatory courts refused to recognize claims that could not be documented, and economic systems that denied credit and legal standing to black farmers made it impossible to rebuild what had been lost. Each mechanism reinforced the others. Removing any one of them from the analysis produces an incomplete picture of how the dispossession actually worked. The $326 billion figure, even as a conservative undercount, raises a question about the relationship between record loss and economic consequence that the standard historical account does not fully address. If courthouse fires, record destruction, and the elimination of property documentation contributed meaningfully to the land loss, and the Jasper County case alone demonstrates that the mechanism was real and operative, then the economic consequences of those fires are not simply a historical curiosity. They are an ongoing reality. The land that transferred after records burned did not revert when the injustice became better understood. It stayed transferred. The oil pumped from Jasper County flowed to whoever held legal title, not to whoever had held the deed before 1932. The timber harvested from land whose documentation burned generated revenue for whoever the court had recognized as the legal owner, regardless of whether that recognition was obtained through the elimination of competing documentation. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult in a way that connects the historical record to the present. The wealth that accumulated from land obtained through record destruction did not disappear when the mechanism of acquisition became better known. It compounded. It passed to heirs. It funded investments in businesses and further property acquisitions. The $326 billion figure represents what was lost to one side of that transaction. The other side of the transaction, what was gained, continued to generate returns. That asymmetry between a loss that can be estimated at the conservative end at $326 billion and a gain that has been compounding for generations is not simply a historical accounting problem. It is a current economic condition with roots in the events this investigation has been examining. However, the timeline does not fully support any simple narrative of cause and effect. The land loss happened over nearly a century, through multiple mechanisms, in different regions, at different rates, for different immediate reasons. Attributing a specific fraction of it to courthouse fires requires the kind of precise documentation that, as already established, no longer exists. Some counties lost records and saw significant land transfers. Others lost records and did not show the same pattern. Some areas with intact records still saw black land ownership declined sharply through other mechanisms. The relationship between record loss and land loss is real and documented in specific cases. Its exact quantitative contribution to the total is, and may remain, impossible to determine. That impossibility is not a reason to dismiss the question. It is the most important feature of the problem. The evidence needed to calculate the damage is the damage. The records that burned took with them not just the documentation of individual ownership claims, but the evidentiary foundation of any complete accounting of what their destruction produced. Some believe that what remains, the $326 billion estimate, the Jasper County documentation, the AP investigation findings, the pattern across hundreds of counties, is sufficient to establish the scale and direction of the harm even without a complete calculation. Others argue that without the precise documentation, any estimate remains too uncertain to support the conclusions that would follow from it. Both positions are defensible. Neither can be proven to the standard that the missing records would have made possible. And that, in the end, is precisely the problem. The fires did not just destroy records. They destroyed the possibility of fully understanding what their destruction cost. By this point in the investigation, the evidence has accumulated to a level where the question of explanation can no longer be deferred. The fires have been documented. The patterns have been identified. The economic consequences have been estimated, incompletely but seriously, at figures that are difficult to absorb. The backup problem, the timing problem, and the response problem have each been examined in enough detail to establish that the standard negligence explanation, while not wrong, is not complete. So the question that remains is the one that serious historical investigations eventually have to confront directly. If the standard explanation is insufficient, what explanations are available? And how well does each of them fit the evidence that survives? There are three primary interpretations that researchers and historians have applied to this pattern. They are not mutually exclusive. They do not all require the same assumptions about intent or coordination, and none of them, when examined carefully against the full body of evidence, fits perfectly. Each one accounts for some of what the record shows. Each one leaves something important unexplained. Understanding why none of them is fully satisfying is, in itself, an important part of understanding what this investigation reveals and what it cannot resolve. The first interpretation is institutional negligence. This is the most widely held view among mainstream historians, and it begins from a foundation that is genuinely solid. America was exceptionally slow to develop serious infrastructure for preserving its own records. The National Archives was not established until 1934, 158 years after the Declaration of Independence. For the entire preceding period, federal records were scattered across dozens of different agencies and buildings, stored under conditions that varied enormously and were frequently inadequate. There was no central authority responsible for ensuring that important records were protected. There was no national standard for fire safety in government storage facilities. There was no systematic program for creating backup copies of irreplaceable documents. Herbert Hoover himself made this observation explicitly during his presidency. He noted that the cost of maintaining adequate fire patrols and security across all the scattered government storage sites around the country actually exceeded the cost of constructing a single purpose-built, fireproof archive building. The economic logic for building the National Archives was therefore not just about preservation. It was about efficiency. Consolidating records in one properly protected building was cheaper than trying to protect them adequately in their scattered locations. That observation, made by a sitting president, tells you something important about the condition of American record storage before 1934. It was not a system. It was an accumulation of informal arrangements, most of them inadequate, maintained by agencies that had other priorities and limited budgets. Under this interpretation, poor and marginalized communities received worse storage conditions for their records, not because anyone targeted them specifically, but because they lacked the political power to demand better. A wealthy landowner with attorneys and political connections could, in theory, exert pressure to ensure his county's deed records were properly stored and protected. A black sharecropper who had managed to acquire land title in the post-Reconstruction South had no equivalent leverage. His records ended up wherever there was space, in basements next to furnaces, in wooden buildings on islands, in warehouses with no sprinkler systems, because the political system that allocated resources did not recognize his interests as worth protecting. That is a serious indictment of the system, but it is an indictment of inequality and indifference, not of deliberate targeting. Negligence, under this view, is both sufficient and accurate as an explanation, but this is where it becomes unclear. Because the negligence explanation, however well supported in general terms, struggles with specific details that do not fit the pattern of random institutional failure. The removal of the backup requirement specifically for the 1890 census, the transportation of state immigration records to a wooden building on Ellis Island before the fire, the decision not to install sprinklers in a facility holding tens of millions of irreplaceable military files, the finding that courthouse fires in Georgia and Alabama exceeded 40%, a rate that, even accounting for the generally fire-prone conditions of the era, is difficult to attribute entirely to the ordinary distribution of bad luck. Negligence explains systems that fail randomly. These failures were not random in their distribution or their outcomes. They were consistent, and consistency, in an investigative context, requires explanation. The second interpretation attempts to account for that consistency without requiring a coordinated conspiracy. It proposes that negligence and deliberate intent operated together, not as a single organized program, but as overlapping phenomena. Under this view, the general conditions of poor record storage and inadequate fire protection were real and produced genuine accidental losses. But those conditions also created opportunities that some actors recognized and exploited deliberately. Knowing that fires were common, knowing that they would be investigated superficially if at all, and knowing that the outcome of a courthouse fire would be treated as an accident regardless of cause, some individuals and groups chose to use fire as a tool precisely because it was already present in the environment as a plausible accident. The Jasper County case is the most direct documented support for this interpretation. 15 men, a deliberate fire, a safe found open, records for one population destroyed, while records for another survived in a separate building miles away. The mechanism described by this second interpretation is exactly what the Jasper County evidence shows. And Jasper County was not unique in its outcome. It was unique in the quality of its documentation. The question that follows naturally is how many other courthouse fires that produced identical outcomes, black records destroyed, white records preserved, land transferred through courts that found no competing documentation, were also deliberate acts that the historical record classified as accidents because the evidence needed to establish intent burned along with everything else. Some researchers find this interpretation compelling precisely because it does not require assuming that every fire on the list was deliberately set. It requires only that some were, that the mechanism existed, was known to work, and was used by actors who understood both the legal system and the evidentiary conditions well enough to know that a fire, even a deliberate one, would almost certainly be treated as an accident. That is a more modest claim than a coordinated national conspiracy. It is also a claim for which at least one documented case of direct evidence exists. The difficulty is that the evidence needed to extend the claim beyond Jasper County to other specific cases burned in those other cases, which means the second interpretation, like the negligence explanation, cannot be proven to the standard that the missing records would have made possible. The third interpretation approaches the pattern from a different angle entirely. It does not focus on individual acts of arson or specific decisions by identifiable actors. Instead, it proposes that what this investigation has documented is a structural process, a set of institutional arrangements that consistently produce the same outcome without requiring deliberate coordination at each point. Under this view, you do not need a conspiracy if the system itself is designed, whether intentionally or through accumulated historical bias, to place the most legally vulnerable records in the most dangerous conditions with the least redundancy and the fewest consequences when the inevitable losses occur. This interpretation draws on a concept that historians of institutional racism have developed in other contexts. Systems do not need to be consciously designed to discriminate in order to produce discriminatory outcomes consistently. They need only to reflect existing power arrangements in their allocation of resources, protection, and institutional attention. A record storage system that provides fireproof vaults to records that powerful constituencies care about and pine shelves to records that marginalized communities depend on is not necessarily the product of a deliberate decision to harm those communities. It may simply be the product of a system that allocates protection according to political power. And in a society where political power is distributed along racial and economic lines, that allocation will produce racially and economically unequal outcomes without anyone having explicitly planned for that result. Under this third interpretation, the pattern this investigation has documented is not primarily a story about arson or deliberate destruction. It is a story about structural indifference operating over a long period of time, producing cumulative losses that compound with each generation. The fires were real. Some may have been deliberate, but the deeper mechanism was the system that housed irreplaceable records in flammable buildings, declined to create backup copies, and responded to their loss with silence rather than reconstruction. Not because anyone planned those specific outcomes, but because the communities most harmed by them lacked the power to prevent them or demand redress afterward. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the third interpretation, while analytically sophisticated and well supported by research into structural inequality, has a weakness that its proponents acknowledge. It explains the general pattern of loss extremely well. It does not explain the specific anomalies, the open safe in Jasper County, the removal of the backup requirement for specifically the 1890 census, the transportation of state records to Ellis Island before the fire, the explicit decision not to install sprinklers in St. Louis. These specific details point toward something more than structural indifference. They point toward decisions made by identifiable people at identifiable moments that cannot be fully accounted for by a framework that locates the cause in impersonal institutional arrangements rather than individual choices. Each of the three interpretations, then, fits part of the evidence and struggles with another part. The negligence explanation accounts for the general conditions, but not the consistent directionality. The deliberate exploitation explanation accounts for specific cases, but cannot be extended to others without evidence that no longer exists. The structural indifference explanation accounts for the overall pattern, but struggles with specific decisions that appear too targeted to be purely impersonal. What no single interpretation does is fit all of the evidence cleanly, without remainder, without anomaly, without a detail or a timing or a specific decision that sits slightly wrong under its framework. Some historians argue that this interpretive impasse is itself the answer, that the pattern reflects a genuine mixture of all three phenomena operating simultaneously and interacting with each other in ways that cannot now be cleanly separated. Structural indifference created the conditions. Deliberate actors exploited those conditions in specific cases. Ordinary negligence produced losses in others that the structural indifference then failed to reconstruct. The result was a cumulative pattern of dispossession that no single explanation fully captures, because no single mechanism fully caused it. That synthesis is intellectually honest. It is also, from an investigative standpoint, unsatisfying. It replaces a clear answer with a complex one. It acknowledges uncertainty rather than resolving it. However, the timeline does not fully support the comfort of leaving the question permanently open either. The losses this investigation has documented were not abstractions. They were the property records of specific families, the arrival documentation of specific immigrants, the service files of specific veterans. The people who held those records are gone, but their descendants are not, and the legal and economic consequences of those losses, the land that stayed transferred, the benefits that went uncollected, the family histories that hit walls, are ongoing realities rather than settled historical questions. The interpretive framework that best accounts for what happened matters not just academically but practically, because different explanations point toward different forms of accountability and different possibilities for redress. That detail sounds minor at first, the question of which explanation is most accurate, until it is examined more closely, because the explanation determines the remedy. Negligence points toward improved archival infrastructure. Deliberate exploitation points toward legal accountability for specific acts. Structural indifference points toward systemic reform of the institutions that produce the conditions. None of those remedies can be fully pursued without knowing which explanation carries the most weight. And without the records that burned, that knowledge remains incomplete. Each interpretation fits some of the evidence. None fits all of it. And the evidence that would settle the question is the evidence that is gone. That is where this investigation finds itself, not at a conclusion, but at the boundary of what the surviving record can establish. Beyond that boundary, the questions remain open. They have been open for a long time, and they show no signs of closing. Every investigation eventually reaches a point where it has to account for itself, where it has to step back from the individual cases and the accumulated evidence and ask honestly, what has this process actually established? What can be stated with confidence? What remains uncertain? And what may never be knowable? That accounting, done honestly, is not a satisfying conclusion. It does not deliver the clarity that an investigation of this length and this weight seems to promise. But it is the only intellectually responsible place for this particular investigation to arrive, because the nature of the evidence, specifically, the nature of what is missing from the evidence, makes certainty impossible in ways that are not incidental to the story. They are the story. So here is what this investigation has established with reasonable confidence. Records burned. That is the foundation. Not one record collection, not in one building, not in one decade. Record collections burned across more than a century of American history, in federal facilities and county courthouses, in island immigration stations and suburban warehouses, in Washington and Mississippi and St. Louis and dozens of other locations across the country. The fires were real. The losses were real. The documentation of what burned, where, and when is solid enough that the basic factual foundation of this investigation is not seriously contested by anyone who has examined it. What is also established, with a level of confidence that the evidence supports, is that those losses were not randomly distributed. They did not fall evenly across the full range of people whose records were held in those buildings. They fell consistently on specific populations, immigrants who had arrived through Ellis Island and depended on arrival records to establish their legal status, Black landowners in the South whose property deeds existed in single copies in single buildings, working-class veterans whose service files were the primary documentation connecting them to benefits they had earned, families whose only official portrait existed in a census that had no backup copies anywhere in the country. The directionality of the loss is documented. It is not a matter of interpretation. It is a pattern visible in the evidence that survives. What is further established is that backup systems were absent in these cases in ways that were sometimes the result of deliberate decisions rather than simple oversight. The 1890 census lost its backup requirement through a specific administrative choice made before the records were created. Ellis Island records were centralized from distributed state storage into a single wooden building through a specific transportation decision made before the fire. Military files in St. Louis were never microfilmed through a specific choice not to apply available technology to their protection. These were not passive failures of a system that lacked the knowledge or resources to do better. They were active decisions made by identifiable institutions at identifiable moments that left specific record collections without the redundancy that would have limited their loss. And what is established beyond any reasonable doubt, in at least one case, is that a courthouse fire was deliberately set with the specific purpose of destroying property records that supported black land ownership claims. Jasper County, Mississippi, September 10, 1932. 15 men. A safe found open the following morning, with its contents reduced to ash. Records for the black eastern half of the county destroyed. Records for the white western half preserved in a separate building miles away. A corporate land claim filed 5 years later. Clear title granted by a court that found no competing documentation. 850,000 barrels of oil subsequently extracted from that property. That sequence is documented. The deliberate nature of the fire is established. The economic outcome is measurable. And the connection between the destruction of the records and the transfer of the land is direct enough that no serious alternative explanation has been offered for the Jasper County case specifically. Those are the things this investigation knows. They are substantial. They describe something real and consequential and inadequately addressed by the historical accounts that treat these fires as separate tragedies rather than as elements of a pattern. But they do not answer the question that the pattern most urgently raises, which is how many of the other fires, the hundreds of courthouse fires across the South, the federal facility losses in Washington and St. Louis, the island fire that erased 42 years of immigration records, followed the same logic as Jasper County. How many were deliberate acts disguised by conditions that made accident the default explanation? How many were opportunistic exploitations of genuine accidents by actors who recognized the legal openings those accidents created? And how many were exactly what they appeared to be? Tragic failures of a system that stored irreplaceable records in dangerously inadequate conditions without sufficient thought for the consequences. This is where the investigation cannot go further. Not because the questions are unimportant. They are among the most important questions this pattern raises, but because the evidence needed to answer them is the evidence that burned. To determine whether a specific courthouse fire was deliberately set, you would need surviving documentation of intent, witnesses, correspondence, subsequent behavior that reveals prior knowledge, physical evidence of accelerants or forced entry, patterns of land claim filings that demonstrate advanced preparation. For the Jasper County fire, enough of that evidence survived or was reconstructed by later investigators to establish the deliberate nature of the act. For most other courthouse fires in the South, that evidence does not exist. It either never existed in recoverable form or burned along with the records the fire destroyed. That detail sounds minor at first, the absence of evidence for intent in most individual cases, until it is examined more closely, because it creates a specific kind of investigative dead end that is different from ordinary evidentiary gaps. In most investigations, missing evidence means the question remains open, but could theoretically be resolved if new evidence emerged. In this case, the missing evidence is not simply absent. It was consumed by the same event whose nature it would have established. A fire that was deliberately set to destroy records also destroyed, in most cases, the physical environment that would have preserved evidence of its deliberate nature. The mechanism of concealment and the act being concealed operated simultaneously, which means the question of intent, for most individual fires, may be permanently unresolvable, not because the answer does not exist, but because the answer burned. Some researchers argue that this permanent uncertainty is itself a form of resolution. The argument is that a pattern this consistent, this directional, and this economically consequential does not require proof of intent in each individual case to establish that something beyond ordinary accident was operating. Under this view, the cumulative evidence, the AP investigation findings, the Jasper County documentation, the backup removal decisions, the response failures, the $326 billion land loss, is sufficient to establish that the pattern was not accidental even if specific individual fires cannot be proven deliberate. The pattern is the evidence, and the pattern, examined across more than a century of American record history, points clearly enough in one direction that the absence of smoking gun evidence in each individual case does not neutralize what the aggregate shows. Others disagree. The counterargument is that pattern evidence, however compelling, cannot substitute for case-specific proof when the claim being made is one of deliberate harm rather than structural failure. Under this view, the consistent directionality of the losses can be explained by structural inequality without requiring deliberate action in specific cases. Poor storage conditions allocated along racial and economic lines, combined with opportunistic exploitation of genuine accidents by actors who recognize legal openings, can produce the observed pattern without any individual fire beyond Jasper County being deliberately set. This interpretation does not minimize the harm. It locates its cause differently, and it insists that the difference matters, both for historical accuracy and for any discussion of accountability or redress. Both positions are defensible with the evidence that exists. Neither can be proven to the standard that the missing evidence would have made possible, and that permanent gap between what can be established and what would be needed to establish more is not a failure of this investigation. It is the investigation's most important finding. The fires did not just destroy records. They destroyed the evidentiary conditions under which the full truth about their own nature could be determined. That is either a remarkable coincidence or a feature of the mechanism. Without the records, it is impossible to know which. However, the timeline does not allow this investigation to end entirely on that note of uncertainty, because while the historical questions may be permanently unresolvable in their full detail, the present consequences of the losses are not historical abstractions. They are ongoing realities that exist in the lives of specific people. Somewhere in St. Louis, in a climate-controlled preservation room, a technician is still working through charred military files from the 1973 fire. The National Archives processes more than 30,000 fire-damaged records every year, carefully, painstakingly, trying to recover names and service histories from documents that crumble at the touch or are legible only under infrared light. The fire ended more than 50 years ago. The work of recovering what it damaged has not ended. It continues because people are still waiting. Descendants of veterans who served in 2 world wars, in Korea, in early Vietnam, who still cannot fully document their family member service because the file that would confirm it is a charred fragment in a preservation queue. The families whose courthouse records burned in the American South are in a different but related position. Their loss is not a charred fragment being slowly recovered. It is an absence, a gap in the deed record where documentation should exist and does not. For families attempting to establish land claims, trace inheritance rights, or simply understand the legal history of property their ancestors owned, that gap is not a historical inconvenience. It is a current legal obstacle. Courts still require documentation. Title searches still hit the same walls they hit decades ago. The fire happened in 1932, or 1947, or 1961. The absence it created is present tense, and the immigrants whose Ellis Island records burned in 1897 are long gone. But the question of what their loss meant, legally, practically, for the families they built in a country that could no longer officially confirm their right to be there, is a question that the standard account of American immigration history has not fully absorbed. Those families navigated a legal vulnerability that the government created and then declined to address. How many of them were affected, in what specific ways, and with what lasting consequences for their descendants is a question that sits in the same category as the others in this investigation. Answerable in general terms, unresolvable in its full particularity, because the records that would make it fully answerable burned on a June night in 1897, and were never reconstructed. This is where the investigation lands, not at a conclusion that satisfies the weight of the questions it has raised, not at a clear assignment of cause and responsibility that the evidence fully supports, but at an honest accounting of what is known, what remains uncertain, and what may never be knowable, and at a recognition that the uncertainty itself is not neutral. It favors the outcome that the fires produced. It protects whatever interests were served by the losses. It places the burden of proof on the people who lost the most, in cases where the proof they would need burned along with everything else. Some things burn completely. Others burn in ways that leave just enough to keep you looking, just enough to establish that something real happened, something consequential, something that the standard account of American history has not fully reckoned with, but never quite enough to be certain about how much of it was accident, and how much of it was something else entirely.